Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. In this next panel session, we will transition from reflecting back on the President's administration to looking forward and the challenges associated with governing in the digital age. To lead us through this topic, please join me in welcoming a recognized leader who has been at the forefront of movement politics for nearly 3 decades. An internationally recognized, indeed, innovator in technology and digital pioneer. Please welcome Mr. Joe Trippi. Joe? Get him, buddy.
Thank you.
All yours.
Thank you. Okay, well, I know what you all have to be thinking. How is it that Joe Trippi, the guy who ran Howard Dean's campaign for president, got into this room? And I got to be honest with you, I have no idea how it happened. I mean, you think you're surprised to see me. I'm pretty surprised to be here. But no, it's really an honor to be part of the 25th anniversary celebration of George Herbert Walker Bush's presidency. And I think it's actually even, to me, more impressive to not just hear all the accomplishments in the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Clean Air Act and the other accomplishments that we heard about this morning in foreign policy and defense, but that then on the 25th anniversary to turn the page a little bit and look into the future and actually start to ask some of the tough questions that future policymakers and future administrations are going to have to deal with, just speaks to the President's leadership and his dedication and to what this facility and the Bush Foundation is about. So that matters a lot to me, and I'm really honored to be here with you. I want to talk to you a little bit about where we are. And we are in a new digital age. Forget everything that you think we all know about digital. That all the change that you've felt in journalism, in politics that you've seen, in revolutions and things like that that you've seen over the past few years. It is nothing. It is the first glimmer of massive change that's going to occur because of the speed and the nature in which technology is building in our society and around the globe. And the best way to look at that for a second is it's a lesson from the year 600. It involves an emperor in present-day, what's now India. And this is a story that the tech industry is well aware of. But what happened was he loved chess and he wanted to give the inventor of chess a reward for inventing this beautiful game. So he had the inventor come to the palace, and the inventor asked for a grain of rice, put it on the first square of the chessboard, and then said, let's put 2 grains of rice on the next square of the chessboard, 4, then 8, then 16, then 32, then 64. And at the end of the 64 doublings, Mr. Emperor, that would be a great gift I would be able to eat, my family would be able to eat. The emperor thought that was a very modest request, probably thinking that it's a bunch of rice like that, couldn't believe that that's all the inventor wanted, and said, so be it, and ordered his other ministers to go get the amount of rice. The problem is, and this is very important to understand about where we are with technology today, the problem is the emperor and the human mind is not very good at understanding the exponential amplifying effect of constant doubling. It's not good at it, it just can't really grasp it. And so it turns out that when you do that for 64 times, when you double from 1 grain of rice, it's 18 quintillion. That's 18 with a whole lot of zeros behind it, or 18 billion. And that is a pile of rice that dwarfs Mount Everest and is a pile of rice that would be 1,000 times all the rice produced worldwide in 2010. Okay, when the emperor realized the mistake that he had made in giving the inventor this basically his whole kingdom, he just had the inventor beheaded. Now, and thereby also basically stunting the new creation of future board games for several centuries. So why is this a lesson for policymakers and future presidents today? Why is it a lesson? And it's really something, again, goes back. Remember that rice doubling. Moore's law. Computer processing power doubles every 2 years. And it has been for a long time. We're already through the first half of the chessboard in terms of the doubling. Butter's law of photonics. Data speed of the network doubles every 9 months. Not every 2 years, every 9 months. You put those two things together. By the way, with him, what's happening is not only the processing power doubling, but the cost of that processing power gets cuts in half. And the size of the chip that can carry that processing power shrinks, which is why sooner or later it starts getting into being able to fit in something like a phone and things like that. But I want to just, it's pretty interesting. I went back in preparing for this, looked at 25 years. Where were we when George Bush became president of the United States? And it turns out, very interesting thing, in 1990, the second year of the president's term, this one computer, this one PC, was the world's first web server. And the World Wide Web was born on that day in 1990. One machine. 25 years later, all that doubling of processing power, all the speeding of the network, and more people joining the network. Today, 2.4 billion people worldwide are on the internet. 6 billion people have cell phones. Most of them now are becoming smartphones that are connected to the internet, and that smartphone sales are moving so fast that it's exceeding the sale of PCs, and we can no longer keep up with how many there are. I mean, the number keeps moving by the hundreds of millions in a very short period. And 1.5 million industrial robots and millions more that are doing a lot of other things besides industrial robotics and manufacturing. That now happened over 25 years. And here's the really important thing to understand and grasp about this and why it's mattering more today than it ever has. All of that, all the processing power that happened over the 25 years, all the doubling of the speed of the network, the power that is in an individual's hand today doubles in the next 2 years. All of it goes into the palm of someone's hands, and they have that power to connect, to interact with their government, to challenge the government, to do many things that are both huge opportunities and represent big challenges for how we move forward. So that doubling, I mean, that's why you're seeing things like Google Glass, drones that can deliver books. They can deliver other things, unfortunately, too. The genomics, all kinds of things that are going to create ethical questions and other questions that are going to be coming into the fore in very, very short order. And government isn't really all that ready for this, in my view. In a lot of ways, we have policies that are in the 20th century for 21st century technology and speed. I want to give you just one example from 10 years ago in the Dean campaign. The FEC, the Federal Election Commission, had this really great law, which was that all people had to file their financial reports, both contributions and spending, on paper. And, when you had a few hundred, maybe a few thousand at most people giving money to the average candidate in a quarter, that was a stack of paper about yay high. And that's what the rule was written for back in the 1970s. But in 2004, with the network growing, what the FEC had never contemplated was 159,000 people giving money to a single candidate in a 1-week period in the end of the June quarter. We literally were in near non-compliance because we couldn't get this stuff done in time. The law was changed now in time for the Obama election of 2008. But what's fascinating to me is 10 years later, in 2014, because this happened in 2004, 10 years later, the United States Senate still requires all filings having to do with the Senate to be done on paper. This is 10 years after we know that things need to change. So, can government keep up? Because the next 2 years and 4 years and 6 years, if you believe what the last few years have seen disruption and change, have seen like overpowering different ways politics have been conducted, watched journalism change dramatically and drastically, watched the Arab Spring and other things that were not necessarily created by social media, but certainly were different and fueled differently by social media. The next 2 years, it doubles, 4 years, again doubles, 6 years. It's going to be very big change. It's going to affect everything from employment and unemployment to our national security. And so today, we're going to look at two different panels. The first one with a bunch of really bright folks who've been really looking at how democracy and governance can be improved, can take advantage of both the opportunities but also meet the challenges of the digital age. And Olivier Knox, the chief Washington correspondent for Yahoo News, will take over now, and I'll return right after the break with the second panel. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming, and a warm welcome to the people who are watching this live broadcast on yahoo.com and news.yahoo.com. I'm glad that this panel is not a retrospective of how George H.W. Bush's administration used the internet. Joe has sketched out a little bit how the world has changed. Obviously, the things you take as commonplace today, I'll text you, I'll email you, I'll see you on Facebook, didn't occur. We hadn't yet been avalanched under AOL starter kits. Whereas in houses across the country, everyone happily types www without thinking. In the Bush White House, of course, there was one W. Not sorry. So why does this revolution matter for politics? Well, it matters for a lot of different reasons. We've seen the explosion of social media, which can serve as an amplifier for one person's voice. People who agree on a cause, on an idea, can find each other online, and that makes it an organizing tool. They can interact with their government. They can interact with individuals in their government. They can interact with agencies. They can get services from their government online. They can petition the government for redress online. And of course, institutions can co-opt all of those things as well. They can find out a lot about you from the very powerful little computer you have in your pocket, for example. I recently came across a pretty good example of the kind of reach that social media and tech really have acquired, and I hope we can show it on the screen. I'll give you a second to take that in. That's a March 27 tweet from the George H.W. Bush account. Probably took a fraction of a second to snap the photo. I don't know, maybe 30 seconds to write the message. And the good folks at Twitter tell me that as of the middle of last week, that had been viewed 1,149,188 times. Just to put that into a little bit of perspective, if that were a newspaper and that were the print circulation, it would be the 4th largest paper in the country. So this is not a meaningless metric. This is not just people playing games online. This is a very important new world of influence and information gathering. And we are extremely lucky today to have a really great panel to discuss the challenges to politics and to government going forward. I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves and to tell us a little bit about what they do. Matt, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm Matt Lira. I'm currently the Deputy Executive Director of the National Republican Senatorial Committee. I'm doing what I jokingly call a sabbatical to the sort of the campaign side. The Republicans are very worried about technology and wanting to catch up, and they've recruited people like me to come in. But before that, and I think the reason it's more relevant to my discussions today, I worked for House Majority Leader Eric Cantor from the time that he was the Chief Deputy Whip in the minority, and really focused on the issues of data and digital and how it impacts both campaigning, of course, and communications, but also governance. And we have had, over the last several years, the unique opportunity to apply this new digital age to the House of Representatives and look at ways in which we can modernize the institution for the world we live in. Zooming out the lens, I think that it's important to recognize that we've been through these kinds of transformations before, that the way in which people communicate has changed once every few generations throughout our nation's history. The Constitution has survived and thrived, and our democracy has gotten stronger over that time. And so I believe that as we go through this transformation, that trend will only continue to exist. But let's look at, Abraham Lincoln was around at the early days of still photography. And with this, the skillful aim of Matthew Brady was able to realize the power of, using still photography to build both a political mandate and to govern a country. FDR famously realized that radio could be used instead of just shouting speeches in auditoriums as had been done historically because there was no amplification. He realized that he could speak in a conversational tone and establish an intimacy with the audience through his fireside chats and govern a nation. And television, came into fore. We all, everyone in this room is familiar with, of course, Kennedy Nixon and how it changed campaigning. But equally, was its impact on governance. If you look at pictures of Senate hearing rooms prior to the 1950s, and some of those rooms still exist, of course, they're built for the business of the Senate. If you look at hearing rooms that were constructed after that period, in many ways they're constructed, of course, for the business of the Senate, but also as sort of television studios. There's light riggings and there's newsman booths and things that were designed to recognize that the way our society communicated had changed, and that to effectively govern that society, those forms of communications needed to be fully integrated into our government. Early attempts at each were relatively ham-handed. And so the first, the first radio spots were essentially someone reading the newspaper into a microphone. And again, eventually they realized that the sound really matters in radio. Early attempts at television, if you're kind of a nerd like myself, and you go back to YouTube, you can see early television hearings and programs from the late 40s, early 50s. And they were in many ways just radio programs with the television camera plopped in the room. And then, of course, people realized, well, the way something looks in television really matters. And so that became part of public and political stagecraft. And I think what we've seen from government today there have been some notable exceptions. And people like Seamus and others that you'll hear later today, Macon, Phillips, and others, who do really good work in this space. But by and large, government has essentially plopped the internet in a government system built for television. And we have yet to master what makes it unique, similar to the way we mastered sound in stagecraft. And just for the purpose of intro remarks, I'll keep it brief, but I believe that unique variable when it comes to the internet age is the deconstruction of audience and making it a fully interactive medium. Interactivity, in my opinion, matters as much for successful digital governance as visual stagecraft matters for television governance and audio matters for radio governance. And mastering that level of interactivity and building not audiences, but true communities that can govern our society collaboratively is going to be a pivotal challenge as we look to maintain the social contract between the public and our governing institutions. And I'm sure we'll talk about more later, but I want to hand it off before I run out all the time.
Thank you. My name is Lorelei Kelly. I'm really excited just from what I've heard today because I can tell this is a really problem-solving audience, and I've seen the whole question of governance and government framed not so much as right and left or more and less, but different. And I can tell you actually sitting on this stage right now proves my point, because I consider myself a progressive, and no matter how you look at this stage right now, I've got a Republican on my left. How often does that happen? So I have, for the last couple of years, been at the Open Technology Institute at the New America Foundation. And what I've been doing is inventorying the oversight process of Congress and looking at where new technology and new transparency rules coincide. And so Speaker Boehner passed a transparency rules package a couple of years ago that has really blown open parts of the process of policymaking. And so they're accessible now as never before. And it's a really exciting possibility to create governance and collaboration in this space. So I've been looking at exactly sort of at what functions of the oversight process, of the policy process, could be decentralized, for example, since time and space and proximity to Congress itself doesn't matter as much anymore. And I've also especially been looking at the functions of citizen engagement and what's called in technology the curation that we need to govern effectively, which isn't the crowd. It's not sort of as much sentiment as substance. It's who are the experts and who do we really need in the room at this time to make the very best outcome, to have context and foresight for policymaking that does the best job for America. So before I jumped into technology a couple of years ago, I was a national security expert on Capitol Hill. I came there from California, and what I did, I was asked to come out by a group of members to set up a study group underneath the committee system that would convene for both Democrats and Republicans to talk about post-Cold War security issues, since the world had changed so dramatically since 1991. Yet Congress itself, when you think about it, the committee system, especially on national security, was really set up to look at the world as it was in 1947, if not earlier. And so in some ways, Congress is better today still prepared to fight Napoleon and Prussia, to fighting any number of complex, interdependent global threats that we're facing. So the reason I went to Capitol Hill and I got so interested in national security is that I lived in Berlin in 1989. I was there as a research scholar, but I happened to work that year in the underground democracy movements of the East, specifically in East Berlin, where I was just taking books over to stock the underground library system. And I guarantee you something somebody said at lunch was so relevant to me is nobody calls it a revolution while it's happening. It's just that this regime is terrible, and these people want something good to read. And it just became natural to sort of start taking stuff over there and helping them stock these books, because you knew that just one of them was going to get passed around to hundreds of different people. So in the course of a matter of months, I saw really what was impossible become inevitable, which was the end of that regime. And so when I came back to the United States, what I realized is that the best way for us to strengthen democracy around the world is to make sure that it's functioning really well here at home. As a person who grew up in the Bay Area and went to graduate school out in California and now lives in DC, I think that we have a lot of work to do to sort of bridge the gap between what I like to say revolutions and institutions. This is not only true around the world in the kinds of uprisings and revolutions we've seen over the last couple of years, where we really, the segue into governing hasn't gone smoothly at all, and we're facing a crisis in some parts of the world, and it's very fragile. Democracy is right now, in my opinion. But that to fill this gap between the tech revolution and our governing institutions, I just look at the language that we talk with in San Francisco and Washington, D.C., for example, which are sort of doppelgangers in ways that probably nobody wants to admit. But I was having dinner in San Francisco a couple years ago, and as a national security wonk, I felt like kind of an outsider. And somebody then at the table started mentioning carriers, and I kept thinking, oh, this is either aircraft or disease. I can take part in this conversation. And so the first thing somebody said to me, no, we're talking about Verizon and Comcast. What are you talking about? So I was thinking, oh, shoot. But here's a little list that I made that are just typical terms that are completely different and flip the conversation between Washington, D.C. and San Francisco. For example, in Washington, D.C., disruption is a national security threat. In San Francisco, it's a business plan. In Washington, D.C., a hacker is sometimes considered a criminal. In San Francisco, those are the artists. In Washington, D.C., or in San Francisco, cyber, anything called cyber is from a 1970s science fiction novel. In Washington, D.C., cyber is in 12 oversight programs in the oversight plans of 12 committees just on the House side in Congress. So you're looking at very different ways, or they're calling it internet freedom, and here we call it cybersecurity. So we have a lot of work to do to bridge this gap. And I just want to say that I'm really happy to be here today in College Station because I feel like this is a very productive step forward in this conversation. Thanks.
Thank you. And thanks everybody for having me. Oh, yeah. Hi, I'm Seamus Kraft, and I'll keep it brief. Thank you for having me. It's a real honor to be here today. The men and women in this room really formed my political consciousness. My first political memories were during the H.W. Bush administration. And I have to say, actually, I gave him the only vote in the second grade presidential election in Marblehead, Massachusetts. So. Just doing my part. Now we're talking about software, technology, and open government, which I know can get a little geeky. Mr. Sununu, Senator Simpson, I would ask you if things get too geeky, just raise your hand and we'll dial it back a little bit. I run a civic startup called the OpenGov Foundation. And what we do is build software and liberate public data. Essentially, we turn this type of information into something that runs on this. And you don't have to be a software developer or a geek to know that you can do a heck of a lot more with what you find on your phone than with a simple piece of paper. Yet government from the federal level all the way down to your local city or town runs mostly on paper. Paper doesn't work anymore. And transforming to a world that is governed by the logic of technology is really hard. And government, frankly, is not doing a great job at that. And what we do at the OpenGov Foundation is help that along. And it's a big lift. It's a transformation that's been long overdue. But like Matt said, it's been done before. What does that look like? Well, I got my start inside the US Congress with these issues. I had no tech background beyond the fact that I had a Facebook page and could operate it. But my boss at the time, Congressman Darrell Issa, gave me a mandate and said, improve the processes of our committee so that we can serve our constituents better, period, full stop. And so I started looking around and say, how do other industries improve? How do they get better? How do they save money? How do they serve their customers better? How do they present a better image to the world? And I kept coming back to technology, applied technology to processes that have been working for these companies in the past. And asked the question, why aren't we doing that here? So the main process, or the main job, frankly, of members of Congress is to pass legislation. I know some of us think it's to raise money for elections or give bombastic speeches on C-SPAN, but it's actually to pass legislation. That's a paper-bound process. And it's done sometimes in smoke-filled rooms, but even in the most transparent paper-bound process, it's still done by a very small number of people. Well, we have 300+ million people in America. Why aren't they in? And so that's where the software came in. We hacked open that process. We put legislation on the internet in a format that you could search, you could comment on, you could discuss, and you could even change yourself. And we produced the first crowdsourced legislation in the history of the US Congress where 1 million+ people showed up to help. And if you look around at government and the way that citizens in America view government, and it's not good. It's very low. Expectations are low. The product is low. Congress does two things, nothing or overreact. And a lot of what we're doing here and what we'll talk about today is fixing that with technology, giving Americans the efficient and effective government they deserve that works for them, but also one where they have a voice and they have a say. And I look forward to this discussion. Thank you very much.
I want to pick up on something you said, Seamus, in talking about paper. And it's something that Joe Trippi mentioned in his opener as well. We had a news story recently about a teenager who suggested to the federal government that to the government in general, that it could save some $400 million a year simply by changing the font that it uses in the documents, because it would shrink the text, which means less paper, et cetera, et cetera. Joe referred to the campaign process and the paper-bound campaign process. It seems to me that political campaigns are using tech in a much more intelligent, innovative, flexible way than the government. Do you think, first of all, do you guys think that's right? Why is that happening? And what are some of the biggest lessons that government needs to learn from campaigns?
Well, I'd say it's somewhat self-evident in the sense that campaigns are largely short-term organizations created to achieve an objective, usually over the span of a year or two, typically designed to self-destruct at the end of that process, raise money, spend money on winning, and then move on, whereas government is designed to last and govern our society for centuries. And so by its very nature, it has more institutional forces and regulations governing that thing. I mean, so it's a simple, take the paper, for example. We're moving to a digital-only world, but we aren't yet in a digital-only world. And so you can save even more money, not just by changing the font, but by removing the printing altogether. But then if you do that, and there's a percentage of, say, 20 to 30, 40% of America without a smartphone, without a digital device, whatever the number ends up being, then they're totally disenfranchised from the process. Whereas in a campaign, it's about, what do I need to win, and how do I get there? And, the only thing regulating that, other than the federal laws about conduct, are, what can I convince the candidate and campaign manager to let me do, versus the regulations that are in place in government. And I think that's an appropriate distinction, but it also speaks to the fundamental challenge that when those reforms are instituted inside government, that they're done correctly. One of the things that I was struck by from the earlier discussion was sort of this concept of the deputies meeting in the National Security Council, was that when government is done properly, the structure and the system works really well, and that it's able to handle crises, and it's able to handle interpersonal conflict, and it's able to handle people, coming from different perspectives. That's why sort of this Madisonian vision of our government has sustained itself. That's why the National Security Council and the crises of the administrations they did so well. And so when we're talking about changing that system and modernizing that system, as we need to do to stay relevant to society, we need to think very carefully about creating systems that will enable different people, different leaders, different parties, different agendas, different arguments to be handled properly as long as the digital era exists. If we get that right, then the public engagement and satisfaction with government will be higher than it's ever been before. And if we get it wrong, it will continue to maintain where it's at, I think. So.
Yeah, I would say that campaign technology has gotten all the headlines lately, but one of the biggest questions I think right now for democracies in general is how do you scale up participation outside of election cycles? And what I have seen in Congress is this tendency to use campaign technology for governing is making governing look more like campaigning. This is not good for the policymaking process. We need to figure out governing technology. This is, again, it's much more explicit needs, being at the right place at the right time with the right people. Let's face it, for policymaking, all information is not created equally. What social media and campaign technology has done in Congress is just created this tsunami of noise. And it's a signal-to-noise problem where we haven't yet figured out how do you address the specific institutional needs. I mean, what you've seen as an institution, Congress has become far less democratic inside with communications, where it's sort of this top-down talking points, or it's sort of political cover for your district, and it's not the information that you need to serve your committee, for example, which is kind of specific, and it's very explicit if you look at any committee plan or oversight plan, and members have institutional responsibilities, and they must fulfill these, even though this isn't what gets the sexy headlines. It's actually the most important fabric of our democracy. So the kinds of things that we need are tools that sort and filter information, more than just overwhelm with noise. And I'm sure all of you probably get these petitions, the petition sites. Like the other day I was talking to a friend of mine who's a chief of staff, and he said, tell your social media people to stop sending me all these clickable links and all these emails. Like what I need is experts in the room and a political incentive to use facts. I mean, that's a huge challenge for democracy, and that's going to require governing technology. And I think it's really exciting because even my antagonistic sort of anarchists friends in California are becoming more what I call curious libertarians who are willing to have this conversation, and I'm hoping that it can be a productive one. So yes, it's a really important question.
Yeah, I would say the notion of competition. That's what a political campaign is. As Joe told you, or as you'll hear a little bit from Macon, who worked for President Obama on his first campaign, campaigns are ordained towards one very discrete, very clear goal that happens on one day every 2 years. It's to get you into a booth to pull a lever for them. That's it. And what you need to do to get that person or to get you in the booth to get there, you're going to try it and you're going to do it. And like I said in my introductory remarks, technology is the easiest and the best place to find that competitive advantage in your industry. And what campaigns do is innovate as fast as they can, because if they don't, the other guy will. And how do you bring that into government? Well, government, as we all know, doesn't have a whole lot of competition. There really is no incentive baked into the notion of government to compete with itself. And that's actually part of the reason why we left Congress to start the Open Gov Foundation. We're still very young and very small, but because we're using technology better, we're already competing against basic government services. Think of the law. You can't get any more basic than that. The laws that govern a city or a town or a state, that's the core information to that community. That's locked up in bad technology and paper. For instance, Maryland, the state of Maryland spent $300,000 in 2012 to publish its laws through a private sector vendor. My team was able to do that in a far better, more accessible, more modern and user-friendly format for $3,000. That's insane. But yet that's money that government is more than happy to keep throwing out the door because there's no competition. So I think we're never going to have alternate governments. Lord, I hope not. But there's a very rich system of people outside of government, in nonprofits, in civic startups, that are working to do that technology development, to do that innovation, but then to give it back, to give it away for free to government to improve the communities that they're living in.
So let me play off that, because the recent Point of Light recipient was a woman who created a Facebook network in response to the blizzard in Atlanta. It helped people communicate with each other, offer each other shelter, but also direct government resources, with an interactive map where people could say where they were, what their situation was, how urgent their needs were. So can government harness this? Should it harness this? And how do we make government responsive the way that this woman on Facebook was? Can we?
I absolutely think we can, but it's really, really hard. And that's something that everybody in the room and everybody watching at home via the internet can challenge their elected officials to do, is to bring this technology into government to not just save money, because that's a big thing. Everybody likes a little more money on their paycheck at the end of the year, but to do it to be more responsive to their needs. If you break a product, you can go online and talk to a customer service representative in 3 seconds. And they will help you fix that problem because you will go for somebody else. Why aren't people asking for that of their elected officials? People have a Twitter account. That's not enough, though, right? You have to use it. You have to respond to your constituents' needs and services. And I think anything that we can do with technology to improve that relationship between an individual citizen and their government that they're paying a lot of money for is a really positive thing.
So, Lorelei, everybody on this panel has talked in one way or another about interactivity, and you talked about good tools. How do we make sure that we're not just moving the DMV line to dmv.gov?
I'm just just thinking about what Seamus just said, I think that there's so many, I work with engineers right now and a lot of very technical people, and the whole goal in a lot of these long-term systemic systems engineering worldviews is sort of automate humans out of existence. And I sit there and I think, guess what, you guys, in politics, we're not going anywhere. Human beings are always going to be the centerpiece of politics and policymaking and those relationships. I think what we need to also rediscover in the United States is sort of a renaissance in civic engagement. And after town halls have become really uncomfortable for a lot of members of Congress because they become opportunities for sort of humiliating individuals who are your elected leaders, whether you agree with them or not. Civil discourse has to be a leadership quality. I loved when somebody said that, President Bush was a gentleman president. That's so true, because when you look at just the basic foundations of democracy, if it's not civil, it's not going to be inclusive. If it's not inclusive, it's not going to be representative. And if it's not representative, you can't call it a democracy. And so to me, the opportunities to sort of mix technology with real engagement and feedback, and that we have to create a constituency in the American public. This isn't all on our leaders. I go to a lot of talks at universities and in public places, and I feel like sort of as a country, we've fallen down this sort of civic memory hole where we don't remember what these institutions and these processes are about. And so one of the other things I want to ask everybody in this room is let's start pushing back against this anti-government narrative. Let's start pushing back against, who here watches House of Cards? Yeah, well, it's dismal, but let me just, I guarantee you, I guarantee you that Congress is not organized enough to be that awful.
That's true.
You can't get a conspiracy out of the Rayburn cafeteria, much less across Independence Avenue. I have a lot of hope, and I think that this is a time where we need to support our risk takers in public office. Again, it's not about more or less, but different, and that we cannot replace the human engagement piece of this. And I would love to see a school like this do something like, for example, set up an innovation fellows program for Congress, like they have in the executive branch. Start giving these sort of technology mashup fellows to district offices. Members right now are working with 40% less staff than they had in 1979, with 1,000% more incoming communication.
We really can't have this panel about government and tech unless we acknowledge that two of the top political stories of the last year were tech-related. The NSA story and, of course, healthcare.gov. I'm going to leave the NSA to the next.
They're listening.
I'm going to leave the NSA to the next panel. I'm sure they're going to thank me. But I do want to talk about healthcare.gov, and I want to leave aside the partisan discussion of the policy. When I was doing some reporting on that last fall, everybody I talked to, including some senior Republican officials, said, shouldn't have been a surprise. Government can't do tech. Government can't do IT very well. This is an intrinsic problem. Was there really something intrinsic to the way the government does technology that makes this kind of a predictable disaster? And this is, of course, the question that we're trying to answer on this panel is, how do we fix it?
Yeah, I think absolutely. Government, well, for one thing, government has typically viewed information systems as sort of a logistical need. So I've got, the phone on my desk, does it work? I've got a television in my office, does it work? And I have a computer, does it work? So I can write memos. Versus looking, and that's important, you need to have those kinds of systems, but versus looking at federal information systems as something much like sort of military policy, the infrastructure you have will either enable or inhibit the ability of policymakers to enact their policies in a digital world. And so, if you have if you make the decision today, there's a lot of debates around military procurement, as there should be. And you make the decision, okay, we're going to build that aircraft carrier. 10 years from now, when there's a crisis, policymakers have that, and they can use that, or they cannot use it. And if they didn't have a second aircraft carrier, then they don't have that option. And I think information systems inside the federal government need to evolve from simply, meeting sort of personnel needs to, okay, so we're digitizing all transactions. in sort of government. We're digitizing, we're going to move, the DMV online or whatever it happens to be. Are we building a system that, like Joe alluded to earlier, that is capable of evolving to where policymakers are going to need it to be in 10 years? Are we even thinking of it that way? Because it's no longer a matter of, whether or not, I can get a memo out. It's a matter of, can I actually implement the policies that, if you're pro or con, that's a whole separate debate. But can I physically implement the policies with the infrastructure I have that the country, either wants or doesn't want, depending on.
So is there any reason for optimism on this? I'm sorry.
Well, I think there is, but I think we've been through the experience of, being through the launch of the site, and I think it's raised the issue, and there are procurement questions there that people like Clay Johnson have talked about, and Seamus might want to get into. But those kinds of issues are now on. I think Todd Park, the chief technology officer, on the cover of Time magazine. So those kind for his role in the response. So that kind of shine the light on those infrastructure needs. And I think that's true at all levels of government. If you're a president dealing with nationwide healthcare system, if you're a congressman dealing with a hearing about an issue in your district, is the hearing live streamed? Can it even be live streamed? Well, if it can't be, you're going to be held accountable because your constituents now expect it to be. Those kinds of questions. And if you're the elected official and you say live stream this, and the answer back is, well, we can't because we don't have the right computer. I mean, that should never be the limiting answer in a democracy as sophisticated as the United States. And so we need to build these systems to be ready so that future leaders can govern the way they want to govern.
Yeah, I think if you look at healthcare.gov, it launched with something like 400 flaws. I mean, can you imagine if Ford launched a new vehicle model that had 400 flaws in it? They wouldn't be around very, very much longer. But that's also the nature of software. Software is a iterative process, just like governance is, just really like this country is, in that you start small, you get a kernel that works, and you build up larger. But the procurement rules in this country, particularly on the federal level, simply do not allow this. And I would encourage everybody to check out Clay Johnson's writing on this topic because it's really good. Something like 94% of large technology projects over the last 10 years have failed. Like government technology failing at 94%, that's absurd. But it's because they buy large. And when you buy a large software project, you're going to get one big lump at the end, and it works or it doesn't. That's just not how software and technology works. And so what I think we can take away from that is going smaller. I think President Obama has done some amazing things in helping to solve this problem, and Macon here has been at the forefront of a lot of those efforts. But it's bringing people like us into government who can build a small pilot project and grow it from there, who aren't beholden to hiring a massive large contractor like Lockheed Martin to build a Titanic that's going to sink. That just doesn't work anymore in the private sector, and we're seeing today it doesn't work anymore in government.
This is a really important question. I'm going to take a little different tack on it, which is I see healthcare.gov and the NSA over-surveillance problem that we have as two sides of the same coin. And the big top line is the difficulty that modern governance has with complexity and handling complexity. And our tendency, the second order problem here is our tendency to migrate complex problem solving to our public servants in uniform. I think we've seen a lot of this over the last, certainly when I was on the Hill, I think we saw it in Afghanistan, where all of a sudden the mission of the military became everything from reconstituting the central bank to building girls' schools to combat. Cybersecurity is the top line and internet freedom is underneath that. It's this tendency, because they have so much more technical competence, the engineers are at the NSA. The NSA started hiring computer scientists long before anyone else. So you have this migration of complex technical problem solving into the military. And so it's understandable and unacceptable at the same time. And I feel like that right now we need to stand back, like the wheels are off and the engine is up right now with the NSA surveillance problem. And I think what we need to do now is start figuring out How do we move forward? And how do we start migrating some of this competence and skills back to the civilian side and really start talking about civil-military balance and competence in technical issue areas, funding, personnel. And one of the things I've been looking at is because I went to the Air Command and Staff College so I could learn how militaries think. And it's this wonderful way of thinking where you have unity of effort, but 3 layers, strategies, operations, and tactics within it. Super helpful for a complex world. So the military is very good at things like situational awareness, learning, documentation, iteration. Those are skills we need to just full on transfer over to the civilian side. And we can do that with some of, for example, the situational awareness tools, like they're called fusion tanks. That the military has for all the moving parts in a battlefield or in warfighting. I think there's ways we can create decision support tools with those kinds of technical rooms. And I know that Arizona State University has built one, but it's called Decision Theater. But how do we adapt some of these wonderful expert knowledge, foresight giving tools to civilian decision making? That's what I want to get out of this.
At one point in his introduction, Joe wondered aloud for the audience, how did I get into this room? As a member of the media, maybe I should be more concerned about how I'm going to get out. Direct communication between Americans and their government, which happens now all the time. I mean, you can't open up any social media without seeing people tweeting at members of Congress. And at other public officials, and now amazingly getting responses back. So you've got this direct communication. You have this incredibly enhanced communication among Americans themselves. I obviously have a dog in this question, in this fight. Where does that leave the media as a tool of accountability and as a platform for messages? When an agency can produce high quality, media quality images, messages, videos, GIFs, whatever, where does that leave us? And should these institutions be in the business of producing this stuff? Where do you guys draw the line? And what does it mean for the future of my industry? I will say, I went to a couple of government websites a few months ago for a piece I was working on. I found a college affordability calculator that told you roughly what the loan burden was for recent graduates, what kind of income they were making. And then I went to the Department of Labor and I looked it up. I looked up professions, and I looked up, out of curiosity, of course, journalist. Bad news, it's on the decline, it turns out. Good news, it's part of the green economy. It's a bleak day. But what is happening to the media as this conversation, the direct conversation between citizens and the government and among citizens themselves, what's happening to the media? Do you think we still have a role to play, and what are the pitfalls for government?
Well, I think obviously the media has a huge role to play, and it will continue to play it. There's no shortage of people in the United States, nor should there be, holding government accountable, looking at it. And as government becomes more transparent in its daily operations, that will create unique opportunities for journalism, both to report on the news, but then also to do investigative stories. I actually believe it's been a tough decade for the journalism as an industry. You've seen the closure of newspapers, throughout the country, the diversification of media, which is kind of sapping advertising revenue, and a variety of other things. But I believe, and there's some, this is just what opinion, but that I agree with Mark Andreessen, who was the early creator of Netscape and who invested in Facebook very early on, that we're about to see a renaissance in the news industry due to the diversification of audience itself. So it used to be, if your story didn't appeal to 30 million people, you couldn't get it on the nightly news because they needed to have a story that was mildly or interesting or above for at least 30 million, because that was, the audience. It was a network audience. And then you had to break down into cable, and now you had to appeal to at least 2 to 10 million people. Well, now you can create really interesting content that might only interest 100,000 people or 5 to 10,000 people, but because you can serve advertising on it that's very targeted, it can become a successive revenue stream. And so I think what we're already starting to see the emergence of this, are more media outlets focused on more specific stories and more specific interest groups. And so that if your concern is, let's say water policy, federal water policy and how that integrates, I mean, that would never have been, absent a crisis, the leading story on the nightly news. But within a community of people who care deeply about it and it is their top concern, you can now, as an entrepreneur, create a media outlet that talks about that one issue, and you're able to sustain, one or two reporters on payroll for that one issue and serve ads to that unique audience. And so those kinds of hyper-focused media channels are going to begin, they're beginning to emerge, and I think represents in some way the future of journalism in a digital age, where it'll be less about a handful of journalists covering everything and more about segmented journalists focused on specific issue areas that are tailored to audiences that care about them. And then to answer your second question in terms of the government producing materials, I think as long as we respect the freedom of speech, there will be a check and balance against the abuse of that by government, and that that the government should provide, along with any sort of tailored material, the raw data to back up whatever conclusions they've drawn.
Having made a lot of those highly produced videos to advance a certain political agenda, it's out there and it's a thing. Caveat emptor, or I don't know how to say YouTube in Latin, but let the YouTube viewer beware. But that's always been the case. We've seen campaign commercials. One of the most effective campaigners I've ever seen, and I love learning about him, is Lee Atwater, who I'm sure is near and dear to a lot of you guys. One of my favorite lines of his is, I ain't gonna spin ya while he's spinning ya. That's part of politics. It's part of the competition. And by the way, I would love to see what Lee would have done with the internet. He would have had a lot of fun, let's just put it that way. But the free press is always going to serve that accountability check on our elected officials and our corporations. I don't see how that changes, but it is evolving. I don't know what that's going to look like in a couple years. Where I think we can find a good medium is when news outlets cover those, direct videos from the White House that, that photographers weren't allowed into. That's where you start to get problems. If there's equal access for, CBS, NBC, ABC, Huffington Post, BuzzFeed, Politico, and the White House, I think you're in a good spot. But when it turns into just straight coverage from, the elected official or staff, then you get into the propaganda realm.
I would say, though, that at least your earlier statements does require disclosure. Yeah. And that's one place that we're having a problem right now. But I do think things like the supply chain tracking of transparency that it allows us to identify conflicts of interest, for example, into the policymaking process. And I have hope for that with new tools, and they're being developed in journalism. I feel comforted that journalism is making a great comeback because it's a profession with an ethical code of conduct that has feelings of responsibilities that are about civics. And I think what it's going to help us do, what we need to do right now with this transparency movement, for lack of a better term, is move from transparency to accountability. And the media has a huge amount to do with that. And just building on what you said, there's real institutionally specific tools that the media could deliver for Congress, just translating government information that comes out, or reporting stuff so that it makes sense in processes. I mean, it's sort of the decade of the process geek right now. I'm sure everyone in this room is excited to hear that. But I feel like something that visual data, the charts, the pictures do for us is it allows us to understand, makes context and consequence and history much more apprehensible in a shorter amount of time. And that is what journalism can do for us. Even like just to create, for every general accounting office now called the Government Accountability Office, These are wonderful treasure troves of accountability for government, but they're almost impossible to read. I remember when I worked on nuclear weapons issues with Senator Lugar and some other folks on Capitol Hill, the best information was locked up in PhD dissertations, which the authors would happily send me in the middle of August, which again is not helpful when you're trying to make policy. But now things like calendars, this is a simple thing, but this is one of the things in the rules package that Mr. Boehner passed, is calendars online, allowing people to anticipate and follow up, process, making us all more comfortable is key to handling complexity.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. And, well, one, I'd say that I think that since George Washington, people have always poked fun at Congress's work ethic, but those of us in the room that have, had the privilege to see it up close knows that was not always perfect, but there's a lot of people working very hard every single day, both members and staff and professionals, to make the system and to try to achieve positive outcome. And process is so key to focusing those efforts in ways that can make it work successfully. And there hasn't been enough respect, I think, for process and its importance. And it's one of the things that the first Bush administration in particular was really good at, was recognizing the importance of process to a well-functioning legislative and government institutions. One moment, though, that I'd like to highlight that relates to this media issue is and some of you in the room will remember this better than I've studied it, but President Bush, in his campaign, I believe, challenged Dan Rather in the evening news, and it was a seminal moment that while doing a live interview, he essentially challenged the host of the show, and it had never really been done before because there was always this deference to the network host and saying, you have an agenda and you know what you're doing, and pushing back against feelings that there was bias. And that was, in many ways, the opening act for everything that came after. The diversification of media amplified it. But today we live in a world where the accountability does go both ways. And prior to that moment, it was, not to say that the media didn't have a bias, but if you believe that it did at that time period, there's nothing you could do about it. You just had to deal with it. And in today's world, from that moment on, as it continued to evolve today, and we've seen it repeatedly, journalists can call out other journalists, campaigns can issue fact sheets, PolitiFact can say that's not true. That's an enormously helpful thing. And I think it speaks well to the next decade of journalism.
All right, Matt, you get the last word of the panel. Seamus, Lorelei, Matt, thank you all very much for a really intelligent conversation. And thank you all, and for those of you watching us on the live stream on yahoo.com, we're going to take a brief break, and we will be back with the foreign policy version of this conversation.
Thank you, panel. 15 minutes.
This wire.
Untape it?
From the floor. I think. Yeah, it is.
I'll walk down with you if
Good times, buddy.
Was an airline company for a while, and then when President Bush became president. You ready? You ready for that? And then just a lot of public affairs came back here. Not bad. Very big place. Thank you. Thank you for being here. No, I'm just gonna. I would actually say I don't mind. Whatever he wants to do.
He would prefer you to say.
Ladies and gentlemen, would you please take your seats? All right, now we're going to get a little bit deeper, and this session is going to focus on geopolitics, diplomacy, and warfare in the digital age. I will turn the program back over to Joe Trippi. When we are done this evening, or this afternoon, we'll see you all back here at 7, but I have some instructions in between. So, Joe, you're up, buddy.
Thank you. We really, I'm actually amazed at the 3 people who agreed to be on this panel. 3 people who've literally been on the front lines of geopolitics, diplomacy, and warfare in the digital age. I want to introduce them briefly. Please hold your applause or anything until I'm done with that, and then each of them will speak for a few minutes each, their perspective from their vantage point, and then we'll move to a discussion. I'm going to start to all the way at the end there, Macon Phillips. It is a true pioneer, was involved in campaigns, but was the first White House director of digital strategy ever, and started in this administration, is now at the State Department, is coordinator in the Bureau of International Information Programs, which I think is State Department speak for Director of Digital Strategy and Public Diplomacy. But it's great that he agreed to be with us today. Then the Commanding General, Edward Cardone, Commanding General of U.S. Army Cyber Command. So again, at the forefront of what we're talking about today. And then Scott Carpenter, who has across the board, was in the State Department, in Near East, in the Bureau of Near East Affairs, was the Director of Governance in the Provisional Government of Iraq, Coalition Provisional Government, and then is now, his vantage point today, which is just amazing to me, is at Google as the Deputy Director of Google Ideas, where they really look at some of the really tough and thorny problems that we face and try to, and this particular part of Google looks at how to take those challenges on, look at the opportunities, and come up with real solutions. So it's a real panel that I think has really been across the board on the front lines of what we're trying to talk about. And Scott, why don't you start off from your vantage point and tell us what your perspective is.
Well, happy to do that. And I just want to say what a great honor and privilege it is for me to be here, to have been able to watch that amazing panel this morning, and to be able to have a chance to sit with President Bush for even a few minutes. I also want to thank him personally for this opportunity to wear a tie. I usually where I go places, I don't pay as much respect, and I say to the audience, I apologize for not wearing a tie, but I work at Google now, so you're lucky I'm wearing pants. So Google Ideas. So I am deputy director of this team at Google Ideas at Google, and this team was formed about 3 years ago, and it was formed by Eric Schmidt, who's our executive chairman. And the idea behind Google Ideas was to look over the horizon, to understand what is going to happen to internet users as they come online that is different than the set of circumstances and situations that internet users face today online. And that this is a critical issue for us. And so our mission, as we stated, is to look at ways in which technology can enable people, individuals, in the face of conflict, instability, and repression. Now, why in the world would a private sector company like Google be looking at those questions? Well, I hope in the course of our discussion that you'll understand better why that is. Now, I want to do some baselining before we get into this conversation. I want to ask, how many of you out there, since this is the 25th anniversary of the Bush presidency are 25 or younger. Please raise your hands. Okay, not a whole heck of a lot of you are out there that are under the age of 25. How many of you remember coming online using Prodigy or CompuServe? Wow, okay, all right, excellent. How many of you have a smartphone in your pocket right now? Excellent, excellent. How many of you have watched Downton Abbey? It's a very important question, very important question. How many of you have an Instagram account? Not bad. Snapchat? Okay. How many of you who are under 25 who have a Snapchat account? All of the under 25s. Okay, just check. I think this is important because of the revolution that Joe talked about in his opening comments. There are 2.4 billion people online, and they have come online by definition from 1987 onward. In 1987, I graduated from college. I sent my first email using a VAX system somewhere on the university campus, and that was pretty much my experience with the internet until the early 90s. Right after college, I went off to China for a couple of years, where I was teaching English, where you couldn't even get a copper-based phone line in the country. There was no communication. You couldn't find out what was going on in any other part of the world. It was amazing that when Tiananmen Square happened, that we all found out about it as fast as we did. When I traveled and lived in Central and Eastern Europe right after the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was something called, just the very beginning of something called the World Wide Web at that point. And so in a very long period of time, honestly, we've had 2.4 billion people come online. And it's only been within the last few years that we have these social technologies, thinking about Facebook. How many of you have Facebook accounts? All right. So, 2004, YouTube, 2006, Twitter, even more recently. And thinking about the spread of those technologies around the world. YouTube right now, the vast majority of all YouTube videos are uploaded from outside the United States or Europe. When I joined Google 3 years ago, 24 hours of video were being uploaded to Google servers every 1 hour? Minute. 24 hours of video uploaded every 1 minute. Now we're at 110 hours of video uploaded every 1 minute to our servers. That's a lot of information. Last year, if you look at just data, we generated more information, knowledge on YouTube than humanity has combined to create in all of history. This is a revolution. And the issue is that those 2.4 billion have come online in places like the United States and Europe for the most part, and only slowly now are building outwards. But that pace is going to accelerate immensely and very quickly. We anticipate the next 5 billion people, the next 5 billion, are going to come online within the next decade. Now, think about this. Two things. We saw that panel this morning, amazing panel this morning. Can you imagine if the global penetration of social media was then what it is today? How it would have complicated the decision-making processes that were then taking place? Think about Somalia just a couple years later after the Bush presidency, when CNN waded in with our soldiers. Why were we there? How did that happen? What drove them to the decision-making to be in Somalia in the first place? It was CNN. And the fact that we had global attention on a problem that we would have never even heard about or thought about until that particular revolution took place. But the second issue that I want you to think about is where in the world are these next 5 billion people going to come online? We all did it in a very slow, methodical way. I think you may have heard of this search engine called Google. Right? You know what a search engine is. You know what a web browser is, an internet browser is. You know what Facebook is as a social media tool. Some of you remember that weird sound that used to happen when the phone would connect, do the handshake to get the internet. What's happening today is people are leaping immediately online, and they're leaping immediately online using smartphones. And where are they doing it? They're doing it in countries and places where there are very weak governments, weak institutionally, no oversight. But we're also where there are profound divisions and cleavages within these places, if you think about it. Religious cleavages, tribal cleavages. When you think about what's happening in the Middle East today, remember that the whole international system, all of the borders that were drawn there, was really a recent thing. 1914, after World War I. All of those cleavages now are accentuated, deepened with the onset of social media. What does that mean for us? The other place where they're going to come online is where states are really, really strong, where online repression is prevalent. Freedom House estimates that two-thirds of the population of the world experiences some sort of censorship or surveillance or repression. 1 in 3 people face it in a very severe way. And the question is, what does that mean for us and for our security going forward? What happens when the internet begins to be balkanized? What happens when information can't flow? Or when, I'll give you a couple of examples, very quick examples. I recently traveled to Burma, and this is a country that is just opening up, and they're bringing the internet to people. And they want to allow for free speech. And what's happening is rumors, if you think about it this way, if you're in a closed society for a long period of time, do you trust the national media? No. Who do you trust? Who do you trust?
Your friends, your people.
Your
like
friends, right? You trust your friends. So what happens when all of a sudden you open up and the first thing you do on the internet is you go to Facebook and you connect with your friends. And you take your existing trust networks and you bring them online and you hear rumors that then you act on. So these dirty Muslims in this area have just raped some woman. Everybody goes out, burns the village, kills everybody in it. I was in Indonesia and asked a young woman, went into an internet cafe, and I said, "Have you ever heard of the internet?" She said, "No." She's in an internet cafe. Never heard of the internet. So what are you doing here? She says, "Oh, I'm going on Facebook." Well, how are you getting on Facebook? Can you show me? She said, "Sure." So she sits down at the computer, and there's an icon there. She hits the icon. She's on Facebook. That's the internet to her. That is the internet. There is no other thing. There's no search engine. There's no news. There's no information. It's just that interaction. Now, given this explosion of social technology, and I want to emphasize something that Joe said, this is the beginning of the tidal wave. This is the tide is going out, and people are saying, we got this. The tide is going out. The tidal wave is still going to be coming in. In the midst of all this, we have to ask ourselves, what does this mean for our institutions? And the panel previously began to touch on that. But it's thinking primarily in the context of a well-established democracy like the United States. It's not thinking about countries where these institutions are inchoate, if they exist at all, and what are the pressures that are going to be brought to bear on those institutions. But what about our institutions that are primarily based on hierarchy? The Department of Defense, the State Department, are instruments of national power. How do they react to this new set of circumstances where the network is faster and faster, where it's distributed, and where people are coming online in so many numbers that being able to understand, let alone prepare for what that means, is going to be extremely difficult. So I wanted to set the stage from my perspective, and why Google is interested in these questions is because they're too important just to leave to government. The internet is our ecosystem, and we need to make sure that it remains kind of clean and safe for people to use. And right now, it's neither. DDoS attacks, malware, all the things that we've heard about, the surveillance programs. These are challenges that we need to face together if we are going to remain safe and secure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bacon?
I'm just going to go ahead and throw out my notes because he just said about half what I wanted to talk about. I mean, he put it very well. I mean, first, let me just say it really is an honor to be here, and I want to thank the organizers and Joe and the president for the opportunity to come speak to all of you. My name is Macon Phillips. I work at the State Department, and before I worked there, I was at the White House, where I started this Office of Digital Strategy. But prior to that, I worked on the presidential campaign, which is really for me where I started implementing a lot of new ideas about technology and government and politics. Before I go into where I wanted to start, I just wanted to tack on one number to what Scott laid out, because I think he did a really good job quantifying some of the trends here. With all this, the statistics with YouTube, all the activity, you know what the number one per capita consumer of YouTube content is? Saudi Arabia. It's really interesting when we look at the habits of regular consumers, regular people on the internet. We tend to think that the United States is this consumer culture, but in fact, if you rack up the major countries, somewhere in the middle of the percentage of people who share everything online. And maybe that's not something we should aspire to be number one on, but when we think about cultures around the world, people are really embracing these sharing technologies in a way that may surprise us. But the point about institutions versus individuals, I think, is absolutely correct. And I wanted to start off today by telling a story that perhaps will bring this into a little bit of relief. So there's a guy in Zimbabwe named Sir Nigel. You can look him up on Twitter. His handle's @SirNige. He's a 32-year-old small businessman who he has a kid on the way, or he has one by now. I met him in January. The thing that's interesting about Sir Nigel being in Zimbabwe is he has a weekly chat about issues that he cares about in Zimbabwe. And he talks about things like transparency and accountability in Zimbabwe. You know, and really trying to build a network of people like him in that country and talk about the issues that he wants to see tackled. I got a chance to meet him because I was out there promoting an initiative we have right now, the Young African Leaders Initiative, where we're trying to connect with this next generation of African leaders. Connect them with the United States, but also connect them with one another. And the embassy there did a great job of programming me. I went and spoke a bunch of different places, met a lot of really fascinating people. But they asked Sir Nigel to really take on the responsibility for promoting a panel, sort of like this one. And he tweeted it to his weekly chat friends. And 300 people showed up at the event. Secret police came too. It was a big party. But it was fascinating because sitting up here and looking out of that crowd, the ambassador and I both said, look around and introduce yourself to someone you didn't know before you came here. Because if the United States can help build that network of young leaders who want to excel in the private sector, in the public sector, in the nonprofit sector, we're doing our job. We're trying to build a better future here in Africa with you. And seeing this digital network, this sort of virtual network, if you will, in real life, it reminded me a lot of the things that we worked on in the White House, certainly a lot of the successes I felt like we had on the campaign trail. And it feels to me like that focus on network building amongst people who share our interests is a really important strategy to prioritize as we move into a more networked world. So fast forward to, I guess last week, we've now built this initiative into 60,000 young African leaders that we're emailing with and chatting with and doing all sorts of stuff. And we had a chat where we basically did the same thing Sir Nigel did. We threw out a hashtag. We asked young Africans across sub-Saharan Africa to join us and talk about various topics. And we were able to analyze all the Twitter users, because you can access a lot of this publicly available data and kind of cut it up in different ways, and determine that 8,000 unique accounts participated. That's pretty good. 1,200 of them were brand new just to join the chat. So now you have young Africans who are joining Twitter so that they can engage with the US government and one another. We were also able to look at this group of 8,000 accounts and determine that the network density within this group increased by 30%. So we're able to quantify that policy objective of strengthening the network among young African leaders who ultimately will be the ones who support one another and move this forward. Because you obviously have an input-output problem when you have 3 people on a computer in the United States trying to chat with 8,000 people. You know, the play is really to build that network. Something that Richard Haas said earlier, I think, is exactly the theme here, that diplomacy is about relationships. And when he brought it up, he was talking about in the context of world leaders and telephone diplomacy and some really important work. But when we think about public diplomacy, we now have an opportunity to have all sorts of new kinds of relationships with regular people. And regular people actually are more powerful than they ever have been. And there's 2 trends, I think, that Scott touched on that I think are just really important to lay out. First, trust in institutions is falling. It just is. Edelman did a big worldwide survey on this to really quantify and get at it. And basically what they came away with was 1 in 6 people trust their government leaders to tell the truth when faced with a hard decision, when faced with a hard question. They just don't trust their leaders. On the other hand, trust in people like myself is ascendant. At a time when you have technologies that help you find people like yourself. And so as a result, you have new centers of power, or growing centers of power. You have Sir Nigel. You have all sorts of new power brokers, interlocutors, as they call them in the State Department. And they don't need to be seen in a negative context. They don't need to be seen as sparks for revolutions or threats, although they can be. They can be seen as change makers and people we want to work with. And so I think it's really important as we talk about this that we also recognize the positive opportunities that we have in this new world, because it's not a question of if this is going to happen, to your point about the tidal wave. It is. It is happening. And it's not a bad thing. In fact, it's an incredibly exciting thing. So I think that there's 2 things that I think about at the State Department. There's a lot of things I think about the State Department, but 2 things I think are relevant here about how the State Department needs to evolve. First, we have to think about public engagement genuinely as dialogue. We have to ask ourselves, how are we changing our behavior based on what the public's telling us through these new channels and through the traditional ones? You know, how is it actually going to be factored into policy making? Because people want to give input. They want to be heard, and they want to see action change based on that. And the second, and this is really tough, is how can we be more nimble and react more quickly as an institution? And we can dig into this, I think, a little bit more depth in the question and answer, but it's a big challenge. For those of you that have worked at the State Department or worked at really any big institution, you understand some of the idiosyncrasies that come along with that. But what I can say, having worked at the State Department for a little over 6 months now, is we have the human capital for it. One of the most amazing groups of people that I wasn't expecting are our Foreign Service officers, particularly our youngest Foreign Service officers that are coming in, and they're digital natives. They're the ones that have Snapchat. You know, and they're asking a lot of really good questions and suggesting a lot of really good tactics. And I think culturally, as leaders in the department, we have to figure out a way that their voices can be heard more. And we have to figure out a way that the department can really make the kind of changes it needs to make very rapidly.
Thanks, Mick. General?
So I just put my notes aside. First, it's a tremendous honor to be here today. Ed Cardone, Commander, U.S. Army Cyber Command. But first, with the digital age, I always like to start off with a positive word, because normally when you hear cyber, what conjures up is a negative word. But when you think about the way the digital age has transformed our society and transformed the military, it's absolutely stunning. And I agree with you that we are on the edge of what I call yet another tidal wave. With that, though, there's also a series of vulnerabilities and challenges. So in geopolitical terms, think about the impact of a fruit peddler in Tunisia causing multinational unrest throughout the entire Middle East that's reverberating today, and we don't really know how that will end. And then when you look at the politics with the ability to have local people engage globally and what that does in subcultures and to the culture of societies, that also has tremendous opportunity and vulnerabilities, especially when you start to think about terrorist networks. So when you put all that together and then you start to think about what does this mean for the military has the same transformation that's undergoing in this society. We have better weapons, better communication, better data. But as we go ahead, it's not cyber for the sake of cyber. Because when you think about it, and I've heard this throughout the two panels I've said in today, it's about the human side of warfare. And that's what's really starting to change. So if you think back, before warfare was organized in what I call a physical domain, we divided it in terms of land, sea, air, space. And then we added this new domain, which I think is a great invention because it causes us to really think about it, cyber. But cyber doesn't exist in the physical domain. It exists in the logical domain. And so, for example, if one of the scourges of the internet are these botnets. And these botnets, the command and control servers for these botnets, you know, if you talk to a leading cybersecurity company, there's now command and control servers in every country in the world that control these botnets. So there may actually be a server in a country other than the United States conducting an attack on the United States, and that country doesn't even know it. And so what are the implications to warfare with this? This is one of the reasons that General Alexander, now Admiral Rogers, there's a lot of discussion on cybersecurity legislation, because most of the rules for what I'm talking about, my words, were written in a 20th century world, and we live in a 21st century world. And so decisions like our denial of service attacks that were against the banks in New York, widely publicized in the Wall Street Journal, are those attacks or not? Well, that is a policy gap, or I would even say is a policy sanctuary, as we sort our way through this as we go to the future. So the way I kind of organize the thinking on this is, first you have the people side, the convergence of land, cyber, and human, because at the end of every tweet, the end of every Snapchat, the end of every email, there's a person, and that person lives in a physical space. And so when you combine that with cyber, then you combine that with human, what this convergence means in the future, we're not really sure, but its implications are going to be profound on warfare. If you go next to the technologies, and talking to Scott earlier, I think the reason we're on a tidal wave is because cloud and virtualization technologies, wire and mobile technologies, and advanced computing technologies are completely changing the computing environment as we know it today. I would not even predict what this will look like in a couple of years. But having just come back from Korea as the commander of 2nd Infantry Division, sometimes when I saw what the South Koreans were doing with their technology and what portions of the United States were doing with theirs, they've leaped over us. And as I encourage people to travel to Asia to see what's really going on out there, because it is simply amazing how the technology is advancing. But the technology is not just for the sake of technology, because it connects with human. And that brings me to the last part, processes. And I thought Lorelei did a great job laying out these processes, and we really need to sort out these processes at the national level, because the Department of Defense is really only responsible for what's called the .mil domain, only our military networks. And other government agencies and private companies are responsible for the rest of the domain. And so when you listen to General Alexander and he talks about the potential for a cyber attack on the United States, who has authority to do what, where, when, all of this is still very, very preliminary in nature. The good news is a lot of work has been done on this. I think President Obama has done a lot of work to try and advance cyber legislation. That said, there's no consensus. I go back to a lot of these rules that we're operating in today are 20th century rules for a 21st century world. It will have implications in the way that we conduct warfare in the future. Because if you do believe that Clausewitz was right and that war is just an extension of politics by other means, then we are going to face this in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. I think one of the things that it strikes me is that all of the, particularly, General, when you talk about how, and I agree with you, I wouldn't predict in 4 years where this is all going to go. It's moving that fast and that big and that disruptive in speed. But the institutions that all of us represent, the State Department's a hierarchical institution, military, very top-down, even Google, as much as it's out there giving people tools and things, it's got a top-down hierarchy. How do we adapt to all this? I mean, how do the institutions, the military may be doing it faster than others. I mean, I know when a lot of tech folks talk to me about going up on the Hill and they just think like it's like, I keep asking them, is it because you don't have enough, you're not getting the funding you need? Is it because you don't have the policies you need? Or is it because when you walk in there, the policymaker thinks you've got tinfoil coming out of your head and doesn't understand a word you're saying? And so I guess what I'm looking for is within what are your views about how do we get our institutions to evolve in a way that deals with this tidal wave that is coming? And I think that's something all three of you could potentially speak to here if you've got thoughts on it.
Well, I think Lorelei put it well in the last panel when she talked about these two different languages that are spoken, let's say in Silicon Valley or Washington. The job of members of Congress is to legislate and create policy and think about these things. The problem is the technology and the way technology is developed happens at a rate of speed that eclipses not only the policy, but also many laws and even now I would say social norms. We're evolving social norms online. What's appropriate? What's not appropriate? What should we be doing? What shouldn't we be doing? And all of that is happening in a context of it's not slowing down. So part of it is trying to build that notion into our policy-making formulation somehow, and I don't know how, because right now the system can't accommodate it. And whenever a system can't accommodate it, those changes go around it somehow. And that's the challenge that institutions are facing, is that there's so much coming at those institutions, so many demands, and when people so you're sending signal and you don't get response, there's no feedback loop, then you go around, you figure out another mechanism for advancing. And so from my perspective, oftentimes when you go up to the Hill to talk to people about what's happening, what do we need to think about, there really is a very shallow understanding of the technology, but not only of the technology, of the way one thinks. There was a discussion earlier, and I'll just make this one quick point, about the healthcare.gov. And Clay Shirky wrote this great piece in Foreign Affairs that I encourage everybody to read, where he's talking about how when you're designing software, you have three things you can optimize for: features, deadline, or quality. Right? And those are the three things you can play with. If you want to get to a deadline, you have to drop a bunch of features. And that may change the quality. If you want real quality, you may not have a lot of features, but you can get to a deadline. But you have to make those choices. And our system tends to optimize for the worst. A deadline, which means but you want all the features and the highest quality. And it's never going to work. And that's the way in which the two different worlds think.
Yeah, and so I say this as a child of Huntsville, Alabama. I am very familiar with what is possible with government procurement and technology. I mean, the Hubble telescope was this thing that was my imagination growing up. Space program, you can look back at actually seeing it work. The world's moving a lot faster now, and we can't be on the same procurement cycles as Hubble space telescopes. I think, looking at what was good about how the defense industry works in terms of what Lorelei laid out, and I think what the general could speak to in terms of planning and methodology and process is very different than our procurement. And it brings up a whole category of issues that I don't think are interesting to people, but are really important, which is modernizing our laws generally for innovation in government. Looking at things like the Paperwork Reduction Act, which is something I know passed under the Reagan administration, we haven't really taken a hard look at modernizing that, and it's a real problem. The Privacy Act in a post-internet world, it's just a really big issue, and there's values judgments that need to be made, some trade-offs that need to be made, but we need to make those. We need to have that conversation. So there's a lot of sort of legal infrastructure, so to speak, that I think is not optimized for where we are right now. Another category that's inhibiting innovation in government, I think, is risk-taking generally. Clearly, the media environment we live in does not reward failure. Leave it at that. And that is felt very much in Washington and I think many other places. Whereas in Silicon Valley or other technology centers, failure is celebrated. Maybe not as much as people would like to think, but it's still understood that there's learnings from it. We're playing a zero-sum game at times when we look at government taking on challenges. And I think that gets back to some of the points that were made in the earlier panel about shifting from rhetoric and politics and actually looking at better government. But that's something that it is factored in when you're looking at how ambitious you're trying to be and how transparent you can be about what you're learning.
So I think we learned a lot in the wars. We learned a lot how to work around all of this. I mean, the integration of state and the Department of Defense in governance, I think, was really amazing. It took us a while to get there, to work through and create provincial reconstruction teams and to figure out how to really use the money. So this idea of using fusion cells in the short term, where everyone brings what they can bring to a table and organizes around a mission in the construct that Lorelei talked about, I think is probably the near term. The acquisition rules, I'd like to kind of go back to what you said. So it works for some things, it doesn't work well for tech, but tech actually has a couple of problems. One is, and I'll speak maybe for myself or many of my peers maybe, which is we don't understand it very well, right? And so we grew up in an age where another speaker said, just make all that stuff work, right? And you didn't have to worry so much about the security, but now you have to understand it, and you have to understand for us, we're starting to view this as a place that you actually do operations, and that's a completely different way of thinking about it. So going back to acquisition, if the people making decisions don't know how to ask the right question, you're never going to get the right product. And then finally, for the military, failure is not really rewarded, especially outside of a combat zone, not even in a combat zone, but there's plenty of data out there that shows the tremendous innovation that goes on during a war, but when they come back, they feel stifled by the policies that are still in place at the start of the war, and some are still in place today. And so, General Dempsey, I think, is doing a lot to try and break this down to the concept of mission command and to understand that we have to take more risk, and that with more risk may come failure, and that not all failure is bad. So I think just those three things right there are going to help us in the long term.
That's true. We've got about 4 minutes left of this panel, so I think what I'd like to do is give you each a minute, 2 minutes to expand on something that you want to expand, or a closing thought.
Well, I'll just say that I have this. One of the best things about working at the White House and working at the State Department as well is I get a lot of classes of interns and young people who come in and want to know the secret, like there is one. You sit there and you look at them and you sort of try to figure out what can I say to them that's going to really break through. And where I've landed is that I'm 35 years old, and I feel incredibly lucky to be born when I was born and be working in this job right now, precisely because of what I think my colleagues have really described well, that the world's changing in a really amazing way. And I have a foot in high school when I used card catalogs to write papers. And you ask these interns if they know what card catalogs are, and they don't know. I tell you that if there was only one, I think they were kind of messing with me, but it's like consistently every time they don't know what a card catalog is, and the teacher always laughs. And then I have another foot in incredible experiences like working on the 2008 presidential campaign and on, where I've really seen the power of technology. But where I feel incredibly lucky is I'm able to appreciate that technology for technology's sake it's meaningless. Mm-hmm. That fundamentally it's how we're deciding to use it. And whether that's researching a paper, whether that's identifying new interlocutors, whether that's protecting our country, the purpose is very important. And so I would just leave this panel reiterating that, along with the threats that come from this tidal wave, that come from these cyber issues, come great opportunities, come incredible scale and efficiencies, and come incredible power to individuals who, in fact, these institutions that we lament are dysfunctional are intended to serve in the first place. So whether that's domestically or with regards to our foreign policy, when I look at what's happened over the last 10 years, I'm profoundly optimistic. I think there's very real threats that we have to keep in mind, but at the same time, we have to say, what are we securing? What are we trying to do if we can't do the positive side as well?
General. The United States of America is incredibly innovative, the innovative leader of the world. I think we just have to maintain that. When I heard, at lunch they talked about the tremendous contributions of President Bush and his team during his presidency, and when you think about it, that was a tidal wave then. Mm-hmm. And look how it turned out. And so I believe we're where we are today. We do have threats, and we have to keep pressing on them and work on this, but the opportunities to grasp what's in front of us and to fundamentally create a more free, prosperous world, I think is right there for us to grasp in this time. That said, I'm supposed to maintain freedom of maneuver in cyberspace, which I will, and then when directed, deny the same to our adversaries, and we will do that. So thank you very much.
Yeah, for me, I feel privileged to have witnessed and grown up in that critical moment when the Soviet Union collapsed and the Berlin Wall fell, and all of the change that was ushered in at that time, and to be witness to that revolution where a lot of people were really profoundly afraid of what was going to happen, and where we were able to celebrate that here today, this morning. And I feel the same way that Macon does, that even as we think deeply about the challenges that face us, this is an exciting time where human potential is perhaps going to be unleashed in a way that exceeds even that of the Gutenberg press, and in a much more dramatic way. What we need to not fear, though, is that our institutions are going to change. They're going to be challenged. They have to adapt. I know that a lot of you have only, may have very strong views about social media and where it's going. I also will bet that your cellular, your smartphone lies within pretty close reach on most of your bedside tables, and is amongst the first things that you check in the morning. It's going to change the way we behave, the way we act, a lot of things. We're going to have to evolve these new social norms together, but this is going to be a really amazing, exciting time. Thank you.
Thank all three of you for...
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Joe, for putting together this marvelous afternoon panel on technology. We appreciate it very, very much. Thank you all for attending. We're at break now until 7. If you need a rest area, hanging out place for the next couple of hours, that's 1011C, which is down the hallway to the that-a-way. Otherwise, the museum and store are open. Buy your 41 socks. That's it, and we'll see you at 7. Thank you very much.